Hello everyone. I know some of you use these videos to fall asleep, and some just for background. I'll be quick, I promise. Before we begin, make sure you like and subscribe, and also comment down below, at what time are you watching this and where from. Now sit back, relax and let's begin. The mountains had always been our place. Every year my younger brother, Ethan and I took a hunting trip deep into the wilderness. Miles away from civilization, we knew the land well. The narrow trails winding through the trees, the streams that ran cold and clear, the spots where the deer gathered at dawn. It was supposed to be just another trip, but this time something was wrong. We arrived early in the afternoon, set up camp, and spent the day scouting. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no rustling, just an unnatural silence hanging in the air. Ethan noticed it too. "Feels weird out here," he muttered, adjusting his rifle strap. I nodded. "It's different." By sunset, we had nothing to show for our efforts. No deer, no tracks. It was like the forest was dead. We decided to turn in early. The fire crackled between us as we ate in silence, the orange glow flickering against the trees. Then, just past midnight, Ethan vanished. I woke up shivering, the fire reduced to glowing embers. I reached for my jacket, but as I turned over, I realized his sleeping bag was empty. The tent flap was unzipped. I sat up fast, adrenaline spiking through my veins. "Ethan." "Nothing." I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the trees. The camp was still, silent. The only sound was the distant whisper of wind through the branches. That's when I noticed something. Footprints leading away from the tent. Bare footprints. Not boot prints. Not boot prints. Bare feet. My stomach dropped. I grabbed my rifle, heart hammering, and followed them into the trees. The tracks led deeper into the woods, curving in unnatural patterns, like whoever made them wasn't walking normally. And then, they stopped. No signs of struggle. No Ethan. Just an empty patch of dirt. I turned in circles, scanning the forest with my light. "Ethan." Silence. Then a sound. A voice. His voice. "Liam." I whirled around, heart hammering. It came from ahead. "Ethan." I called. "Where are you?" A long pause. Then from the dark, "Come here." The voice was off. Too slow. Too careful. Like someone was testing the words. A cold wave of dread washed over me. Something was wrong. I took a step back, gripping my rifle. Then, just before I turned to run, a twig snapped behind me. I spun around, and something was crouching in the brush. Too big, too long, something that shouldn't be there. And it smiled. I couldn't move. The thing in the brush was watching me. Even in the dim glow of my flashlight, I could see the outline of a body, crouched low like an animal ready to pounce. But it wasn't an animal. It was Ethan, or at least it looked like him. Same face, same clothes, but wrong. His mouth was too wide, his arms were too long, and his eyes, they weren't Ethan's. They were black and hungry. A shudder ran through me. Then from the darkness, "Liam." I jerked the flashlight toward the sound. Another Ethan stood at the edge of the trees, half hidden in shadow. He was staring at me, shivering, his voice hoarse. "Liam, please," he whispered. "It's me." I whipped my head back to the first one. The thing still crouching in the brush. It was grinning now, its jaw unhinged too far. Slowly it began crawling toward me. The real Ethan gasped. "Run." That was all I needed to hear. I bolted. Branches tore at my arms as I crashed through the trees. I could hear Ethan running beside me, his breath ragged, but behind us, something else was running too. Faster, gaining on us. A sound ripped through the night. Not human, not animal. A horrible chattering screech. I felt my legs go weak, my vision narrowing. "Move, move, move." We broke through the trees, our camp appearing ahead like a beacon. I sprinted for the fire pit, gasping for air. I turned, raising my rifle, but the thing wasn't behind us anymore. The woods were silent, just the sound of the wind whispering through the trees. I turned to Ethan, panting. What the hell was that? His face was pale, shaken. "I don't know," he stammered. I woke up and meant a tree, Something took me and stuffed me inside a hollow tree trunk. I couldn't move. I couldn't move. I couldn't move. I signed I forged up. I grabbed his shoulder. You're okay. You're okay now. He nodded quickly, but something in his eyes was still scared. And then, the fire went out. A gust of wind swept through the clearing, snuffing out the flames. The night swallowed us in darkness. A slow scraping sound came from the trees. Then, Liam. My blood turned to ice. The voice was Ethan's, but my brother was right beside me. I whipped the flashlight back toward the trees, and there, standing at the edge of the forest, was another Ethan, its head tilted unnaturally far to the side, its mouth stretched open in a grotesque smile, and it stepped toward us. I stood frozen, gripping my rifle so tightly, my fingers went numb. The thing at the tree line had Ethan's face, but it wasn't Ethan. It took another step forward, moving too smoothly, like it was gliding just above the ground. Its limbs hung too loosely, its joints bending in ways they shouldn't, and its eyes, they were empty, a deep, endless black. The real Ethan grabbed my arm, his breath ragged. Liam, he whispered. That's what took me. My pulse slammed in my ears. The thing mimicking Ethan took another step toward us. Then it spoke, in my brother's voice. You left me behind. A chill ran up my spine. No, it was testing the words, trying them on, like a mask. I lifted the rifle, aiming at its chest. It stopped. Then it grinned. Not a human grin. Its mouth stretched too wide, too full of teeth. And then it dropped onto all fours, and charged. Run, I shouted, shoving Ethan toward the trees. We sprinted, crashing through the undergrowth, our boots pounding against the forest floor. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear it, galloping behind us, its breath ragged and uneven, its body too fast, too wrong. I spotted an old tree trunk ahead, half rotted, its insides hollowed out. There, I yelled. We dove behind it, pressing against the damp wood. I dropped to one knee, rifle shaking in my hands. And then everything went silent. No footsteps, no wind, nothing. Ethan clamped a hand over his mouth, his eyes wide with fear. My own breath came in short gasps. I forced my body to stay still, to listen. Then, crunch, right behind the tree. I swallowed hard. My hands were slick with sweat, my rifle trembling. I reached into my pocket and felt a lighter. Fire, fire, fire was the only thing that could kill it. Slowly, carefully, I reached for a broken branch near my feet. I grabbed it, flicked the lighter open. A small flame danced in the darkness, and then, it lunged over the tree. I thrust the torch upward. Flames licked across its face, and it screamed, not like an animal, not like a person, something else, something that had never been human. The thing reeled back, its skin blistering, peeling. It stumbled away, writhing, letting out a horrible guttural shriek as it disappeared back into the shadows. The moment it was gone, the forest came back to life. Wind, leaves, insects chirping, like it had never been there at all. Ethan and I stumbled to our feet, gasping. Is it dead? He whispered. I didn't know, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. We're leaving, I said. We didn't stop running until we reached the truck. We tore out of there, speeding down the dirt road, the headlights cutting through the night. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us looked back. By the time we reached civilization, the sun was rising. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. Ethan sat beside me, silent, shaking. Finally, he spoke. Do you think it's still out there? I didn't answer, because I already knew. The thing in the woods wasn't dead. Not really, but it wouldn't wear my brother's face again. I had been a park ranger for almost a decade, and I'd seen my fair share of strange things in the backwoods of Montana, but nothing like this. It started with the disappearances. 5 missing campers in 2 months. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just abandoned tents, half-eaten food, and the eerie silence of the forest. Something wasn't right. The last case was a young couple, Jake and Aaron. They had set up camp in an area not too far from an old hunting ground. one that hadn't been used in years. We found their tent ripped open from the inside. Their belongings were still there, even their boots, but they were gone. No tracks leading away, no sign they had ever left on foot, like the forest itself had swallowed them whole. So when my supervisor sent me to do a solo patrol of the area, I didn't argue. Something was out there. Something was hunting people, and I was going to find out what. I set out in the early morning, hiking deep into the untouched parts of the forest. The deeper I went, the more I noticed it. The silence, no birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. I found the cabin just before sundown. It was old, rotting, half swallowed by the forest. Moss crept up the wooden walls, the windows were clouded with grime, and the door hung slightly open, like it had been waiting for me. The air reeked, something sour, rancid. I stepped inside. The cabin was empty. No furniture, no signs of recent life, just rotting wooden floors, and the damp stink of decay. But the walls were covered in old animal pelts, or at least, that's what I thought at first. Some of them looked wrong. The fur was patchy, uneven, like it had been peeled from something that wasn't quite an animal. Some of them were hairless. Some of them looked like skin. My stomach tightened. That's when I heard it, scratching, from inside the walls. The scratching didn't stop. It was inside the walls. Not mice, not rats. Something bigger, something slow, something that knew I was here. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around my flashlight. The room was small, barely more than a single open space. The only door led to what I assumed was a storage room or bedroom. The scratching came from inside that wall. I took a step closer. Creak. The floorboards groaned under my weight. The scratching stopped. I held my breath. For a moment, nothing. Then, a low, wet breathing sound, right behind the wall. Every muscle in my body screamed, "Get out!" But I couldn't. I had to know. I raised my flashlight and moved toward the wall. The closer I got, the stronger the stench became, a mix of rotting meat and damp fur. I swallowed back the nausea. My hand hovered over the wall, and then something thumped against it, hard. The wood bowed outward, like something had rammed into it from the other side. I staggered back. My heart slammed in my chest. A long, low moan echoed through the cabin. It wasn't human, and it was hungry. I stumbled toward the door. A second thump. This time the wood cracked. A sliver of rotting material peeled away, revealing something beneath it, something that looked like bone. I didn't wait. I turned and ran. But the moment I reached the front door, the wall burst open, and something crawled out. I didn't have time to think. The wall burst open behind me, sending splinters flying across the room. Something crawled out, and it wasn't human. It was thin, skeletal. Its arms were too long, fingers ending in jagged claws. Its ribs pressed against its skin, every bone visible beneath patches of rotting fur. But its face, God, its face, it had no lips, just jagged yellow teeth, stretching across an impossibly wide grin. Its eyes were sunken, deep black pits, but they were staring right at me. And then, it moved. Not like a man, not like an animal. It crawled toward me on all fours, its limbs snapping and twisting with every step, like it had forgotten how to use them. A low clicking noise rattled from its throat. I ran. I slammed through the front door, stumbling onto the porch. The air was thick, suffocating, the trees too still. Behind me, the thing screeched. I didn't look back. I ran straight for the tree line, lungs burning, my boots pounding against the dirt. I had my radio, my gun. Neither would help. Not against this. I needed a plan. Fast. I crashed through the trees, weaving between thick trunks, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The Wendigo was behind me. I could hear it moving. Fast. Too fast. The ground shook beneath its steps. Branches snapped as it gained on me. Then I saw it. A clearing. The ground was scattered with dry brush. That was it. My only chance. I grabbed the flare gun from my belt and spun around, my chest heaving. The Wendigo was already there. It was crouched at the tree line, half hidden in the shadows. Its ribcage expanded with every breath, that horrible clicking sound growing louder. It was waiting, studying me, testing to see if I'd run again. I raised the flare gun. Its head twitched. I pulled the trigger. The flare exploded into the brush. Fire erupted. The dry wood caught instantly, flames rushing up the trees, spreading in all directions. The Wendigo screeched. It lunged back toward the cabin, retreating into the smoke. I didn't wait. I turned and ran. The fire spread fast, crackling through the dry underbrush and licking up the sides of the old cabin. Thick black smoke poured into the sky, and the air filled with the stench of burning wood, fur, and something worse, something rancid and wrong. I stumbled back, coughing, watching as the flames swallowed the cabin whole. The Wendigo had disappeared inside, retreating from the fire like some instinct had told it to. But I knew it wasn't dead. Not yet. Then I heard it. A scream, long drawn out, and inhuman. It came from inside the cabin, from deep within the walls where it had been hiding for God knows how long. The sound was a mix of something dying and something furious, like the fire had heard it, but not enough to kill it. The walls of the cabin buckled inward, beams collapsing, sending embers flying into the sky. I turned to run, barely able to see through the thick smoke, but as I did, a deafening crash shook the ground behind me. Something had burst through the roof. I spun around just in time to see it. A massive blackened figure leaping from the burning wreckage. It was on fire, its flesh searing, the fur patches on its body turning to ash. Its limbs spasmed and jerked, its skull-like face twisting in agony. But even through the pain, it was still moving, still alive, and it was still coming for me. I ran, harder than I ever had before. My legs screamed in protest. My lungs burned from the smoke, but I didn't dare stop. I knew if it caught me, I wouldn't just die. I would become another name on the long list of missing campers. The sounds behind me grew louder. The snap of branches, the crackling fire, the horrible, unnatural clicking. I risked a glance over my shoulder and nearly tripped. It was chasing me, even as its body peeled and burned. Even as flesh dripped from its bones, it was still coming, but it was slower now. The fire had done something, weakened it, and then I saw my only chance. Ahead of me, the land sloped down into a rocky ravine, the jagged cliffs cutting off into a steep drop. The Wendigo was only a few steps behind. I didn't hesitate. I dove to the side, rolling hard onto the dirt, my body screaming in pain as I slammed into the ground. The Wendigo wasn't as lucky. It had been too focused on me, too consumed by hunger to realize where I had led it. It tried to stop, its claws digging into the dirt, its burned arms flailing, but it was too late. With one final, shrill scream, it tumbled forward over the edge. I scrambled to my feet, rushing to the cliff's edge just in time to see it fall. It crashed against the jagged rocks below, its body still burning, its limbs contorting and twisting as it shrieked into the night. And then, finally, silence. I stood there, gasping for air, my heart hammering so hard, I thought it might give out. The fire behind me raged on, consuming the last remnants of the rotting old cabin. But the thing inside it, the thing that had been taking people, was gone. I stayed there until the sun began to rise, too shaken to move. It was only when I heard the distant sound of a search helicopter, likely sent to find me after I failed to report in, that I started walking back toward the main trail. I told my supervisor everything, the disappearances, the cabin, the thing that had lived inside its walls. I expected him to call me crazy, but instead he just listened. When I finished, he nodded slowly, then said, "We'll mark that section of the forest as off limits, permanently." And that was it. No police reports, no follow-ups, just quiet acceptance. The disappearances stopped after that. No more campers went missing. No more stories of people vanishing without a trace. But even now, I still dream about it, about that thing crawling out of the walls, its skin peeling away like old leather, about the clicking sound it made when it moved. And sometimes, late at night, when I close my eyes, I swear I can still hear it, screaming. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. As I set up camp deep in the woods, far beyond the reach of roads and civilization. The dense forest surrounded me on all sides, the towering trees swaying gently in the late autumn breeze. It was exactly the kind of isolation I had come here for. I had spent years perfecting my survival skills, testing myself in the harshest conditions, pushing further away from the safety of towns and trails. This time, I had ventured deeper than ever before, determined to spend an entire week alone in the wilderness. No phone, no maps, just my gear, my instincts, and the quiet company of the trees. The first night passed uneventfully. I sat by my small fire, listening to the distant cries of owls and the rustling of unseen creatures in the underbrush. The isolation was comforting. Out here, I was the only human for miles. At least, that's what I thought. By the second morning, my sense of solitude cracked. When I crawled out of my tent and stretched, I noticed something strange in the frost-covered soil around my campsite. Footprints, not mine. They were massive, far larger than any bear's, and oddly elongated, as if whatever had made them walked on two legs. The tracks circled my tent in a slow, deliberate path. My breath turned to mist in the cold air as I crouched down, tracing the indentations with my fingers. Whatever had been here was heavy and curious. I scanned the trees, my senses sharpening. Nothing moved. The forest was silent, too silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie stillness that pressed against my ears, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. I stoked the fire and went about my day, foraging and checking my snares. The tracks could have been a trick of the frost, an odd distortion caused by the shifting ground. That's what I told myself. Anyway, that night, the forest felt different. The air was colder, the silence heavier. I sat by my fire longer than usual, staring into the darkness, waiting. Then I heard it, somewhere beyond the trees, a faint clicking noise. Not an animal, not the wind. It was deliberate, almost human. I stayed up as long as I could, my rifle resting across my lap, my ears straining against the quiet. When exhaustion finally pulled me into sleep, it was restless and filled with whispers I couldn't understand. When I woke the next morning, the footprints were back, and they were closer. The footprints circled my camp again, but this time, they weren't just along the perimeter. They led straight to my tent, right up to the flap. I crouched low, following the deep impressions in the soil. My pulse pounded in my ears. Whoever, no whatever, was out here had been standing just inches from where I slept, listening, watching. A thick unease settled in my gut. As I packed up my things, I had planned for a week, but I wasn't about to sit around waiting for whatever was out here to get bolder. I'd hike back to the river and follow it south. Civilization was still miles away, but if I pushed hard, I could be back in 2 days. As I made my way through the woods, the feeling of being watched never faded. Every so often, I'd stop and listen, scanning the trees, my hand tied around my rifle. Then as the sun dipped low, I heard something that made my blood run cold. My own voice. It was distant, twisted, but unmistakable. An echo of something I had said the night before. Not too bad out here, it murmured. My own words, spoken in a voice that wasn't quite right. Too choppy, too hollow. I tightened my grip on the rifle, my breath coming in quick, shallow gulps. My gut told me to run, but I forced myself to stay calm. To think, running blind in the woods was a death sentence. Instead, I veered toward the frozen lake I had seen the day before. If something was stalking me, I could use the open space to see it coming. I reached the edge of the lake, just as the last light of day faded. The ice stretched out before me, dark and solid, the wind howling across its surface. I set up a small fire near the shore, my back to the frozen expanse. The night was long. Every sound, every whisper of wind through the trees set my nerves on edge. And then, just before dawn, I heard it again. A voice, right outside my tent. Low, raspy, chattering. I'm hungry. The words sent a bolt of terror through me, freezing me in place. The voice was wrong. It had a strange clicking undertone, like bones knocking together. Slowly, I reached for my rifle, my fingers stiff with cold. The fire outside my tent was still burning, casting flickering shadows against the canvas. Through the thin fabric, I saw movement, tall, gaunt, with limbs too long, and fingers that twitched unnaturally. A sickening stench drifted into the tent, a mix of rot and blood, and something worse, something ancient. I had one chance. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed my pack and lunged out of the tent, firing a shot into the air. The thing flinched, its hollow eyes reflecting the firelight. It was towering, skeletal, its skin stretched tight over jagged bones, antlers jutted from its skull, and its mouth, far too wide, curled into something that almost resembled a grin. I ran. The ice was my only chance. My boots pounded against the frozen surface, my breath ragged in my chest. Behind me, the creature followed, its movements unnatural, disjointed, yet terrifyingly fast. I pushed forward, my heart hammering. The ice beneath me groaned in protest. Just a little farther, just a little more. Then I stopped. The creature hesitated, its black eyes gleaming with hunger. It stepped forward, one long, skeletal limb pressing onto the ice. A crack splintered through the air. Another step, another crack, and then with a deafening snap, the ice gave way. The creature let out an ear-piercing shriek as it plunged into the freezing water. Its clawed hand scrambled at the edge, its hollow face twisting in fury. I stood there, watching as it struggled, the dark water swallowing it inch by inch. Its lips moved, forming words that never reached my ears. Then, with one last, desperate grasp at the ice, it sank. The forest fell silent. I didn't wait. I grabbed my pack and ran, not stopping until the sun rose and the trees thinned into familiar territory. I never went back, and I never will. The snowstorm swallowed her whole. One moment she was there, wrapped in her thick winter coat, her scarf pulled high, her gloved hand gripping mine, as we trudged through the waist-deep snow. And then she was gone. It had happened so fast. The wind howled through the trees, a living thing of ice and fury. And in that instant, I lost sight of her. I shouted her name, my voice ripped away by the storm, my heart hammering against my ribs. I ran forward, stumbling, clawing at the snow, but there was nothing, just endless white. My breath burned in my throat as I scanned the storm for any sign of her. Footsteps, movement, anything, but the snow had already erased all traces of her. I should have never let her go outside. The storm had hit fast and hard, turning the woods around our cabin into an unforgiving void. We had been on our way back from checking the old hunting traps, our routine task before the heavy snowfall made the trails impassable. I had begged her to wait, to stay inside where it was safe, but she was stubborn. She always had been, and now she was gone. I searched through the night, and now she was gone. I searched through the night. I screamed her name into the storm, my voice growing hoarse, my limbs numb from the cold. I moved in frantic circles, desperate, refusing to accept the truth that gnawed at the edges of my mind. No one could survive this. No one. By the time the storm finally began to die down, I could barely stand. My body was on the verge of collapse, my fingers stiff with frostbite. But I didn't stop searching, not until exhaustion finally won, dragging me back to the cabin, hollow and broken. I barely slept. I left the door unlocked, just in case, and when dawn came, I forced myself to go back out. I expected to find nothing. I expected to see the same endless expanse of untouched snow, the same silent trees standing like frozen sentinels. But I was wrong, because that morning, she came back. She walked out of the trees, as if nothing had happened. But the moment I saw her, every part of me screamed that something was terribly, horribly wrong. She stepped inside without a sound. The warmth from the fire washed over us, melting the frost that clung to my coat. But she didn't react. No sigh of relief, no shudder from the temperature change. Nothing. She just stood there. I closed the door behind her, my hand lingering on the latch. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to lock it, to keep her out. But I didn't, because if this wasn't Sarah, if this was something else, then I needed to know. She moved deeper into the cabin, her motions too smooth, too precise. She should have been exhausted. She should have collapsed. But she didn't even sit down. She just turned to me and stared. "You were gone all night," I said carefully. "How did you find your way back?" Silence. The fire crackled. The wind whispered against the windows. Then finally, she spoke. "I never left." Her voice was quiet, flat, like she was repeating something she had heard rather than actually answering. A chill rippled through me. I forced a small, hesitant laugh. "Yeah, you did. You got caught in the storm. Remember, I looked for you all night." She tilted her head slightly, her gaze never leaving mine. "You should have stayed inside." My fingers curled into my palm. Something was wrong. So wrong. "Sarah," I said slowly, trying not to let the tremor slip into my voice. "Are you feeling okay?" "I'm fine." The words came too fast, too practiced. She hadn't blinked once. My throat tightened. "You must be freezing. Come by the fire." She didn't move. Instead, she just smiled. A slow, unnatural curve of the lips. Then she took a step closer, and I saw it. Her feet weren't touching the ground. My stomach dropped. For the first time, I let myself truly look at her. Her clothes were the same, but they were too clean, untouched by the night she had supposedly spent lost in the storm. No frost clung to her. No damp spots from melted snow. Like she had never been outside at all. Like she had never been human at all. My pulse thundered in my ears. I took a slow step back, gripping the chair near the fireplace. She took another step forward, gliding, her feet inches above the wooden floorboards. The wrongness of it was suffocating. "Sarah," I whispered. She smiled wider. Then she spoke in a voice that wasn't hers. "You let me in." The room felt smaller. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows along the wooden walls, but none of them touched her. It was as if the light itself refused to acknowledge her presence. I gripped the back of the chair, my knuckles white. "What did you say?" She tilted her head. That same eerie, stretched smile plastered across her face. "You let me in." Her voice wasn't right. It had Sarah's tone, Sarah's softness, but it was hollow, like wind rushing through dead trees, like something pretending to be human, but failing. I swallowed hard. "You're not my wife." Her smile widened, revealing teeth that were just a little too sharp, a little too uneven. "I am." No hesitation, no emotion, just a statement, as simple as breathing. But she wasn't breathing. I forced myself to stay still, to not bolt for the door, even as every part of me screamed to run. I needed a plan. I thought back to the old stories, the warnings whispered by those who lived deep in the coldest parts of the world. The Wendigo was a hunter, a predator, a thing that mimicked the voices of the lost to lure its prey, and I had let it in. The fire. The thought struck me fast and hard. The only reason it hadn't attacked yet was because of the fire. That meant I still had a chance. I moved slowly, stepping sideways toward the shelf where I kept my hunting gear. I needed something, anything, to give me an edge. Her head snapped toward me, her two wide eyes locking onto mine. "You're afraid?" It wasn't a question. My fingers brushed against the heavy iron poker, leaning against the hearth. "You're not Sarah." She took a step forward. No, not a step. She floated. The tips of her toes hovered inches from the ground, her body weightless, unnatural. "I am your wife." Her lips formed the words, but they didn't match the way she was speaking, like a puppet reciting rehearsed lines. I tightened my grip around the poker, my pulse hammering. Her head tilted again, slow and unnatural. Then she lunged. I barely had time to react. I swung the poker, the iron slicing through the air. As she closed the distance between us, in the blink of an eye, the metal connected with her side, and for the first time, she reacted. A shriek tore through the cabin, high-pitched and inhuman. Her body convulsed, twisting unnaturally, like something inside her was shifting, breaking apart. She stumbled back, her fingers curling like claws, her face contorting. For the first time, she blinked, but it was wrong. Her eyelids flickered sideways, like an animal, like something that wasn't made for this world. I didn't wait for her to recover. I turned and ran. I ran for the back door, heart pounding, breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind me, the thing that wore my wife's face let out another piercing shriek. The sound was wrong, too high, too hollow. It rattled through the walls of the cabin, seeping into my bones like frostbite. I reached the door, yanking it open, but I didn't run outside just yet. I had a plan. If the old stories were right, I couldn't kill it with brute force, but fire could end this, and I had just the thing to hold it long enough to burn. The bear trap, I had set it near the tree line days ago, baited for something else entirely, but now it would serve a different purpose. I sprinted into the snow, the cold biting into my skin, the wind howling through the trees. My boots crunched against the ice as I made my way toward the trap, every muscle in my body screaming to move faster. Behind me, I heard the thing give chase. It didn't run, it glided. I could hear it, soft deliberate movements, like something floating just above the ground. A whisper of movement, a shadow at my back. I didn't dare look. I reached the spot near the trees, the bear trap barely visible beneath a layer of fresh snow. Now came the hard part. I had to get it to step in. I spun around just in time to see her. It emerging from the darkness. The thing still looked like Sarah, but only barely. The illusion was slipping. Its limbs were too long, its mouth too wide, its lips peeled back, revealing jagged, yellowed teeth that didn't belong in a human mouth. It cocked its head, studying me. "You can't run," it whispered, its voice fractured, like a dozen voices layered over one another. "You let me in." I forced myself to take a step back, closer to the trap. "I know what you are," I said, voice hoarse. The thing smiled. "Then you know you can't escape." It took a step forward, another step, then, snap. The bear trap's jaws slammed shut around its leg with a sickening crunch. The creature screamed, a sound so sharp, so shrill, it shattered the silence of the woods. It thrashed its body, contorting, clawed hands, scraping against the snow. But the iron held firm. Now was my chance. I grabbed the lantern from my belt, the one I always carried at night, and smashed it against the ground beside it. Oil spilled over the snow, soaking the creature's trapped limbs. Then I lit a match. For a second, it just stared at me, and then, as the flames ignited, it shrieked, a sound unlike anything I had ever heard. It flailed, its body catching fire in an instant, the scent of burning flesh filling the air. I stumbled backward, watching as it writhed, as its form began to change, shifting and twisting into something unrecognizable. The fire burned high, crackling in the cold night air. And then, finally, silence. The thing that had stolen my wife's face was gone. I stood there for a long time, staring at the flames, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. It was over, but I never found Sarah. The first time I heard the knocking, I thought it was the wind. My cabin sat deep in the wilderness, far from roads, far from neighbors, far from anyone who might come knocking in the middle of the night. The nearest town was over 20 miles away, and the only path leading here was an old snow-covered trail that no one used but me. I had come here to escape, to leave behind the noise, the crowds, the constant hum of life that had worn me down over the years. Out here, the only sounds were the crackling of my wood stove and the occasional howl of distant wolves. Peace, solitude. That was the life I had chosen. So when I heard the faint, rhythmic tapping against my window, I didn't react at first. The wind often threw pine branches against the glass, making dull, uneven thuds. That had to be it. But then it happened again. Tap, tap, tap. Soft, measured, deliberate. I sat up in bed, my breath visible in the cold air of my unheated room. The fire in the main room had died down to embers, leaving only a faint orange glow through the doorway. The window beside my bed looked out into the darkness, a square of inky black framed by frost. I hesitated before reaching for the flashlight on my nightstand. Click. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the frost-coated glass. My breath caught in my throat. There was nothing there. No branches, no shifting shadows, just the endless stretch of snow-covered ground outside, untouched and undisturbed. I exhaled, shaking my head. My imagination was getting the best of me. Maybe it had been the wind after all. I shut off the flashlight and lay back down, pulling the covers tighter around me. The rest of the night was silent. By morning, I had almost convinced myself it hadn't happened at all. But the next night, the knocking came again, and this time I wasn't so sure I was alone. The knocking started just after midnight. Tap, 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 soft, persistent, closer. I sat up, heart pounding. The fire in the main room was still burning this time, casting flickering shadows across the walls. The cabin felt smaller, the darkness pressing against the windows, thick and heavy. I reached for the flashlight again, but something in me hesitated. Last night, there had been nothing, but this time, I felt something outside, a weight in the air, thick and unnatural. Tap, 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 tap. I gritted my teeth, inhaled sharply, and flicked the flashlight on. The beam cut through the dark, landing on the frosted window, and I saw it. A figure stood in the snow just beyond the glass. Tall, too tall. Its emaciated body looked barely human, its skin stretched tight over protruding bones, a sickly gray against the white backdrop of the snow. The thing's head was wrong, elongated almost deer-like, but its eyes were human, hollow, black pits that swallowed the light. I couldn't move. It didn't react to the beam. It just stood there, its breath curling in the cold air. Then, slowly, its mouth stretched open, wider than any mouth should, a thin cracked jaw unhinged, bones creaking as it whispered in a voice that wasn't meant to exist. "Let me in." The words slithered through the cold, not muffled by the glass as they should have been. I sucked in a sharp breath, my skin crawling, my instincts screaming at me to run. But I couldn't. My body was frozen, locked in place by the sheer wrongness of what I was seeing. Then, as if it could sense my fear, the thing did something that nearly sent me into a full panic. It lifted one bony, clawed hand and pressed it against the glass. The window groaned under the weight of it, frost spreading from where its fingers touched. The air inside my cabin turned colder, my breath misting in front of me even though the fire still burned in the other room. It was waiting, watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. I don't know how long I sat there, locked in place, staring at the thing that had come knocking on my window. But at some point, I did the only thing I could think of. I reached for the matches on my nightstand, my hand trembling, and I lit a candle. The moment the small flame flickered to life, the thing reacted. Its head snapped toward it, those hollow eyes narrowing. Then, as if the fire had suddenly burned through whatever hold it had over me, it took a slow step back, its fingers peeling away from the glass, with a sickening crack. And then, without another sound, it vanished into the trees. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, and I knew, deep in my gut, that it would come back. The question was, how long could I keep it out? I didn't open the door. I didn't even step near the window after the thing disappeared into the trees. Instead, I spent the rest of the night in the main room, huddled near the fire, every muscle in my body coiled tight. The air inside the cabin still felt wrong, cold, heavy. Watched. By dawn, the feeling hadn't faded. When the first pale slivers of sunlight filtered through the frost-coated windows, I forced myself to move. I needed answers. Wrapping myself in layers, I stepped outside, my boots crunching against the fresh snow. The air was bitterly cold, biting at my skin. But it wasn't the cold that made my breath catch in my throat. The snow around my cabin was covered in prints, not just footprints, tracks, deep, clawed indentations that started at my bedroom window and led away into the woods. They weren't human, not even close. I followed them for a few feet before stopping. The more I stared, the more I realized something was wrong with them. The steps were too far apart, like whatever had made them was moving in unnaturally long strides. And worse, the tracks, they weren't consistent. Some were deep, others barely pressed into the snow at all, like the thing had only been half there. I swallowed hard. This wasn't some trick of the mind. Something had been here, something real. I turned back to the cabin, my mind racing, I needed to be prepared. I didn't know if this thing could break through doors or shatter windows, but I wasn't going to find out. I spent the day reinforcing the cabin, stacking more firewood inside, sealing gaps in the door frames, anything to keep out the creeping cold that seemed to follow in that thing's wake. But as the sun dipped lower, that same weight settled into my chest. It was coming back. By nightfall, the fire was burning high, the warmth filling every corner of the cabin. I sat by it, my rifle in my lap, my ears straining for any sound outside. Then, just as I had begun to convince myself that maybe, I had scared it off, the knocking returned. Tap, tap, tap. This time it wasn't just at the window, it was at the door. I gripped my rifle tighter, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Then from the other side, I heard it whisper again, "Let me in." The voice was closer now, more insistent, more hungry. I squeezed my eyes shut, my mind racing through everything I knew about creatures like this. Wendigos, legends, warnings, stories told by those who lived in the deepest, coldest parts of the world. Creatures born of greed and hunger, cursed to roam forever, seeking to feed, but they could be repelled. I needed fire, I needed silver, and most of all, I needed to survive until dawn. The knocking didn't stop. Tap, tap, tap. Soft at first, like fingertips brushing against the wood, then harder, more insistent. I stayed rooted to my chair, gripping the rifle with white-knuckled hands, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Let me in." The voice slithered through the door like a whisper on the wind, curling into my ears, into my skull. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. There was something wrong in the way it spoke, something that bypassed my ears and dug straight into my bones. I clenched my teeth, forcing myself to breathe. I knew the stories. A Wendigo couldn't come inside unless it was invited. That was the only reason I was still alive. But it was patient. It could wait. The fire crackled beside me, and I clung to its warmth like a lifeline. Fire and silver. Those were my best defenses. The problem was, I only had one of them, but I had to work with what I had. Moving carefully, never taking my eyes off the door, I reached for the cast iron pot, hanging near the hearth. Inside were the ashes from the firewood that had burned all day. Ash. I remembered something about that. Old legends spoke of Wendigos, fearing fire, not just the flames but the remnants. Ash was a reminder of what could destroy them, a trace of something that could burn them down to nothing. I grabbed a handful and sprinkled it along the floor by the door. Then I moved to the window, doing the same, creating a barrier of fine gray dust. The knocking paused. For the first time since it started, I heard something else outside, a slow, dragging breath. It was smelling the air, testing me. I swallowed hard, moving quickly. I had salt in the kitchen, not much, but enough to mix with the ash. If the fire kept it at bay, and the ash was tied to that fire, then salt, another old ward against evil, might strengthen the barrier. I didn't let myself hesitate. I poured the salt in a line along the window sills, and reinforced the ash circle near the door. Then I waited. The knocking didn't return, neither did the voice, but it was still out there. I could feel it. The night dragged on, long and silent. Hours passed without another sound, but I didn't dare let my guard down. I sat by the fire, the rifle still clutched in my hands, watching the glow dance across the walls. Then, sometime just before dawn, I heard it move, a slow scraping sound. Not on the door, not on the window, on the roof. The breath caught in my throat, my mind raced. The chimney, my heart pounded as I grabbed more salt, more ash, and tossed it into the fire. The flames surged higher, sending a burst of heat through the cabin. I didn't know if that would be enough, but it was all I had. The sound above me stopped. Then, for the first time, I heard something new. A growl, low, guttural, frustrated. It hadn't expected me to fight back, and it wasn't happy, but it didn't come down the chimney. It didn't try the door again. Instead, it waited. The Wendigo was patient. It had all the time in the world. The only question was, did I? I didn't move. I barely breathed. The thing was still up there, crouched on my roof like some nightmare-given form. I could hear the faint creak of wood under its weight, the slow shifting of its limbs as it adjusted itself, waiting, thinking. It wasn't mindless. That was the worst part. It was intelligent. A deep scraping breath filled the silence, followed by something that made my stomach twist in knots. A chuckle. It was soft, barely audible over the fire, but it was there. A dry rasping sound like leaves crumbling in the wind. It was toying with me, daring me to make a mistake. I clenched my teeth, forcing my thoughts to stay sharp. It hadn't attacked yet, which meant the salt and ash were doing something. But the fire wouldn't burn forever, and the moment the flames died out, I knew it would try again. I needed something stronger. Silver. It was one of the few traditional weaknesses I hadn't used yet, and I only had one piece of it, an old silver pocket knife tucked away in a drawer. I didn't know if it was enough, but I had to try. Moving slowly, I reached for the drawer, keeping my eyes on the ceiling as I fumbled for the knife. My fingers closed around the cold metal, and the moment I touched it, something changed. The sound on the roof stopped. For a long tense moment, there was nothing but silence. Then a low, inhuman hiss. I gripped the knife tighter, my pulse racing. It knows, the Wendigo knew I had something it feared. The wood above me groaned. As it shifted its weight, I braced myself, expecting it to come crashing through at any second. But then, the first slivers of sunlight bled through the trees. A sharp guttural snarl echoed from the roof, followed by the sound of something leaping, farther than anything human could. I rushed to the window just in time to see it disappear into the tree line, its skeletal frame vanishing into the snow-covered forest. And then it was gone, just like that. I collapsed into the chair by the fire, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The room still felt cold, but the air was lighter somehow, like a weight had lifted. I didn't sleep. I barely moved until the sun was fully overhead, burning away the last traces of night. Only then did I step outside, half expecting to see more tracks, more signs that it was still out there. But the snow was untouched. No footprints, no claw marks, no sign that anything had been here at all. If not for the salt and ash still lining my door, I might have thought I imagined the whole thing. But I knew better. I packed up that day. I didn't wait for nightfall. I didn't tempt fate. By the time the sun set again, I was miles away from that cabin, putting as much distance between myself and that cursed stretch of woods as I could. I never went back. I should have never gone into that cave. The mountains had always called to me, their jagged peaks and winding valleys, promising something untouched, unexplored. That was why I became a spelunker, to go where no one else had gone, to crawl into the veins of the earth and uncover its secrets. But some things were meant to stay hidden. I had been mapping a series of caves deep in the northern range, far from any known trails. The locals didn't come up here. They spoke of bad omens, of strange figures glimpsed through the trees. Stories, I had thought, just stories. Then I found the entrance. It wasn't marked on any map, no records of it, no signs that anyone had ever been here before. It was a narrow opening at the base of a sheer rock face, hidden behind a thicket of dead trees. A cold wind seeped from the darkness beyond, carrying with it a scent that made my stomach twist. Something old, damp and wrong. I hesitated. For the first time in my years of exploring caves, I hesitated, but curiosity was a powerful thing. I adjusted my helmet, switched on my headlamp, and crawled inside. The walls of the tunnel were rough and jagged, scraping against my gloves as I moved deeper. It wasn't like any natural cave I'd seen before. The passage twisted unnaturally, the rock worn smooth in places, clawed in others. I nearly turned back when I saw the bones. They littered the ground, half buried in the dirt. Some animal, some too broken to identify. But there were so many. Skulls cracked and hollow, ribs snapped in half. Something lived here, and it had been feeding. A chill crept up my spine. I turned, ready to leave. But then, I heard it, breathing, slow, deep, wet, right behind me. I froze. My light flickered against the walls, illuminating claw marks that ran deep into the stone. Something moved in the shadows ahead. Something big, The air turned heavy, thick with the scent of rot. I wasn't alone in the cave, and whatever was with me was hungry. The breathing grew louder, slow, deep, hungry. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. But I knew better. In the dark, in the depths of the earth, sound was everything. A single misstep could echo through the cavern, could tell whatever was back there exactly where I was. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering against my skull. The light from my headlamp flickered against the jagged walls, casting shadows that stretched and twisted, making it impossible to tell where the cave ended and where the thing watching me began. I needed to get out. Slowly, painstakingly, I shifted my weight, inching backward toward the narrow tunnel I had crawled through. My boots barely brushed the ground, my breaths shallow, measured. Then, a sound, not from me. A low guttural clicking, the kind of sound bones make when they grind together. My stomach twisted. I turned my head just enough to catch a glimpse of movement in the darkness. A shape tall, gaunt, wrong. It stood just beyond the reach of my light, its limbs too long, its fingers curled like claws. It was watching me, its hollow eyes reflecting the dim glow of my headlamp. A Wendigo. The stories had always described them as skeletal, emaciated things, starved, cursed, to hunger forever. But this one was worse. Its skin stretched impossibly tight, over jagged bones, its mouth gaping open as if its jaw had been broken long ago. The stench of rot and old blood filled the air, clinging to the walls, sinking into my skin. And then, it moved. Not a step, not a lunge. It slid, a blur of motion that shouldn't have been possible in the narrow cave. One moment, it was in the shadows. The next, it was closer, too close. I did the only thing I could. I ran. My boots pounded against the stone as I sprinted back toward the narrow opening, my lungs burning, my mind screaming at me to move faster. Behind me, I heard it follow, not running, not chasing, gliding. The sound of it moving was wrong, like bone scraping against stone, like something not meant to exist in this world. The exit was close. I could see the faintest sliver of daylight ahead, spilling into the tunnel. I wasn't going to make it, not unless I did something drastic. I skidded to a stop, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The walls around me were loose, cracked. If I could bring part of the cave down, trap it inside, I might have a chance. I turned, gripping the jagged rock beside me, and did the only thing I could. I started to dig. I clawed at the loose rock, yanking at jagged edges, breaking off pieces as fast as my frozen fingers could manage. The stone crumbled beneath my grip, sending small avalanches of dust and debris cascading down. Behind me, the Wendigo moved. I heard it, felt it, gliding toward me, its unnatural limbs twisting in the tight space. The clicking of its joints echoed off the walls, growing louder, closer. I dug harder. The tunnel shuddered. A crack split through the ceiling, a deep splintering groan reverberating through the cave. Just a little more. Then the breath hit the back of my neck, hot, rotting, too close. I turned just for a second, just long enough to see. The Wendigo loomed inches from me now, its gaunt frame folding unnaturally to fit the tunnel. Its hollow eyes gleamed in the dim light, its gaping mouth curling into something almost human, almost a smile. It reached for me. I threw myself backward, slamming my body into the weak rock. The cave collapsed. Stone came down in a deafening roar, cutting off the tunnel, sealing the Wendigo inside. For a moment, I thought I had buried myself with it. Dust filled the air, choking me, burning my eyes. The weight of the collapse pressed against my back. But there just ahead, a gap, the exit. I scrambled forward, gasping as I pulled myself through the narrow opening and into the blinding light of day. Cold air hit my skin, sharp and real. Safe. I collapsed in the snow, coughing, my body shaking. The entrance to the cave was gone. Nothing but rock and rubble remained. For a long time I just lay there, staring at the place where I had nearly died, where something else still lurked beneath the surface, trapped but not dead. I could still hear it, faint, distant, a slow rhythmic clicking, a reminder, some things aren't meant to be found. and some things should never be set free. The fire crackled, casting long shadows against the towering pines. The 5 of us sat around it, wrapped in our jackets, sipping from metal cups of cheap whiskey to keep the cold away. The night was quiet, too quiet. No owls, no rustling branches, just an eerie stillness that settled deep into the bones of the forest. I should have noticed it sooner. Elliot, the loudest of our group, was in the middle of telling some exaggerated story about a run-in with a bear last summer. When Darren nudged my side, "Hey," he muttered. "Do you see that?" I followed his gaze toward the tree line. At first I saw nothing, just the dark silhouettes of trees stretching into the night. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw it, a shape, tall, thin, motionless. A figure stood just beyond the fire's glow, half hidden among the trees. Its body was gaunt, its limbs impossibly long, its skin a pale ashen gray. It didn't move, it just stared. A chill ran through me, and I swallowed hard, nudging Elliot to shut up. "Do you see that?" I whispered. He turned, his laughter dying in his throat. Then the others saw it too. No one spoke. The fire popped, sending sparks into the air, and for a moment I hoped that maybe it was just a trick of the light, maybe a gnarled tree, a shadow cast at just the right angle. But then I saw its eyes, 2 sunken hollow pits, reflecting the fire like shards of black glass. We sat frozen, not daring to blink, barely daring to breathe. Then Darren did something stupid. He grabbed his flashlight and aimed it at the figure. The moment the beam hit it, it vanished, not like an animal darting away, not like something running deeper into the woods. It was just gone. The trees stood empty. The night was silent once more. "Did you see that?" Darren whispered, his voice tight with panic. None of us answered, because we had, and none of us wanted to admit it. But we all knew the truth. We weren't alone out here. Something was watching us. We should have packed up right then and there. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get back in the truck and drive as far from these woods as possible. But none of us moved. Maybe we didn't want to admit what we'd seen. Maybe we thought, if we ignored it, it would just go away. But it didn't. The fire burned lower as the night dragged on, the warmth barely touching the cold that crept into my bones. Nobody talked anymore. We just sat, watching the trees, pretending we weren't scared. Darren was the first to break the silence. "We should get some sleep." His voice was forced, strained, like he was trying to sound normal. "It's probably nothing." Nobody argued. One by one we crawled into our tents, though I doubted any of us would actually sleep. I lay on my back, staring at the nylon ceiling, my heart pounding with every rustling leaf outside. I don't know how long I stayed like that before exhaustion took over. And then, I woke up to a sound, soft, slow, deliberate, something moving outside my tent. I held my breath, my body stiff with fear. I could hear it, light footsteps in the dirt, circling the campsite. Too light for a bear, too slow for any animal I knew. I turned my head, my throat tightening. The zipper of my tent was moving. I barely choked back a gasp as I fumbled for my flashlight. My fingers trembled as I flicked it on. The beam slicing through the dark. There was nothing there. The zipper was closed. The footsteps had stopped. I waited, my ears straining, my heart hammering so loud I swore it would give me away. Then, from the other tent, I heard Elliot's voice. "I think someone's out there," he whispered. A pause. Then Darren, voice shaking. "Yeah, I know." None of us moved. Then, the night fell silent again. No footsteps, no wind, nothing. I don't know when I finally drifted off again. But when morning came, I woke to something even worse. Elliot's tent was empty. He was gone, and at the edge of the woods, neatly folded in the snow, were his clothes. But there were no footprints, no tracks leading away, just the open trees, watching us, waiting. None of us spoke. We just stood there staring at the neatly folded clothes at the edge of the woods. Elliot was gone. No footprints, no drag marks, no signs of a struggle. just vanished. Darren was the first to move, stepping forward with slow, hesitant steps. His breath came in short gasps, misting in the cold air. "This doesn't make sense," he whispered. I didn't respond. None of us did, because there was only one explanation, and none of us wanted to say it out loud. Something had taken him. I turned to the others. "We need to leave. Now." Darren didn't argue. Neither did Marcus or Ben. Without another word, we packed up, shoving our gear into our bags with frantic hands, barely bothering to zip our tents. Every second we stayed felt like an invitation for whatever was out there to come closer. We moved fast, too fast, because we didn't realize it at first, didn't notice, until Darren stopped dead in his tracks, his face pale. "Guys," he whispered. We turned. He wasn't looking at us. He was looking past us, at the trees. At it. The thing stood there, half hidden between the pines, just like before, tall, skeletal, unmoving. Its hollow black eyes bore into us. It didn't blink. It didn't breathe. It just watched. I felt something tighten in my chest, a cold, suffocating pressure. Then Marcus exhaled, voice barely a whisper. "The legend." I barely turned my head. "What?" "The legend," he said again, slower this time, his voice hollow. I remember now. He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "If you hear it, run. If you see it, don't blink." The words sank in like ice water. We were staring at it, and it wasn't moving, because it was waiting for one of us to look away, for one of us to blink. I felt my eyes burning, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "Back away," I whispered. Nobody argued. We moved slowly, step by step, never breaking eye contact, never blinking. My eyes stung, my vision blurred, but I didn't dare look away. The trees thinned. The road was close. I could see the truck just ahead. 5 more steps. 4, 3, 2. I opened the door with shaking hands, my back still to the woods, and slid inside. The others did the same, and the moment I turned the key, the engine roared to life. I hit the gas. The truck lurched forward, tires spitting up dirt and snow as we sped down the trail, the trees blurring past us. I didn't stop, didn't breathe, not until we were miles away. Only then did I glance at the mirror. The tree line was still, empty, but I knew better. It was still there, waiting, and somewhere, in those silent frozen woods, Elliot was gone. The storm had come out of nowhere. 1 minute, the road was clear, just a long empty stretch of asphalt, cutting through the frozen wilderness. The next, snow was hammering against my windshield, thick and blinding, swallowing the headlights in an endless swirl of white. I clenched the wheel, my knuckles stiff from the cold. The heater in my rig was working overtime, but it barely made a dent against the creeping chill that seeped in through the doors. Nights like this, I hated being a trucker, but I had a delivery to make, so I kept my foot on the gas, watching the road vanish under the storm, mile after mile. Then, a shape appeared in the snow, a figure. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A shadow maybe, a road marker blurred by the storm. But as I got closer, my stomach turned. It was a man. He stood at the edge of the highway, barefoot in the snow, his skin pale and raw against the wind. The storm howled around him, but he didn't move. He just stood there facing away from me. His spine curved like he'd been out there too long, naked, alone, in the middle of nowhere. My foot hovered over the brake. Every instinct told me to keep driving, to pretend I hadn't seen him. But I couldn't. No one could survive a blizzard like this, not without shelter. If I left him out here, he'd be dead in minutes. I slowed the truck. The figure still didn't move. I rolled down the window just a crack, enough to yell through the wind. "Hey, you okay?" No response. I hesitated. Something about this didn't feel right. The snow swirled around him, covering his bare feet, sticking to his skin, but he didn't shiver, didn't flinch, didn't react at all. Something cold curled in my gut. I reached for my radio, my fingers stiff as I fumbled with the switch. "Dispatch, this is Route 42 northbound. I gotta..." Then, the man turned, and my blood went cold. His eyes were black, Not dark, not shadowed. Black, two empty voids, hollow and gleaming, reflecting the glow of my headlights. And his mouth, his lips peeled back, stretching too wide, revealing jagged, uneven teeth. Not human. Not right. My breath caught in my throat. And then, he started to move. The thing took a step forward, not a normal step. Not the slow, stiff shuffle of someone half frozen, desperate for help. It glided. Its feet barely touched the ground as it moved toward me. Its mouth still stretched in that unnatural grin, those jagged teeth catching the glare of my headlights. A primal fear locked my muscles in place. I had seen roadkill, seen animals caught in my high beams, their eyes flashing just before impact. But this was something else. I slammed my foot on the gas. The truck roared beneath me, tires spitting ice and slush as the rig lurched forward. The figure blurred past my window, and then for the briefest second, as I sped by, it twitched. Its head snapped toward me so fast, I almost didn't register it. A blur of white skin and black eyes. Its mouth unhinged, opening too wide, and then it was gone, swallowed by the snow. I didn't look back, didn't even breathe until I was miles down the road. The storm still raging, the wipers scraping against the windshield. Only then did I glance in my side mirror. Nothing, just darkness and snow. I gripped the wheel tighter, my hands slick with sweat. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Anything rational. Hypothermia could do strange things to a person. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was some drifter, some poor bastard lost in the storm. But deep down I knew better. Because as I drove, the temperature inside the cab dropped. The heater was on full blast, but the air turned freezing. My breath misted in front of me. And then, a sound, soft, barely audible over the engine. A slow clicking chatter. My stomach twisted. I had heard something like that before. In documentaries, the sound of bones shifting. And it was coming from the back of my truck. The sound came again. A slow rhythmic clicking. Like bones grinding together. Like something shifting inside my trailer. I gripped the wheel so hard my knuckles ached. That's impossible. The trailer was locked. Sealed. There was no way anyone could have gotten inside. Unless, the thought sent ice through my veins. Unless it had never been outside to begin with. I pressed down on the accelerator. The truck roared forward, tires cutting through the snow. I kept my eyes on the road, forcing myself to focus, to push aside the primal fear clawing at the edges of my mind. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But then, a heavy thump rattled the walls of the trailer. Something big shifted inside. I nearly swerved off the road. My pulse pounded in my ears. My breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The clicking sound stopped. And then, a new noise. A whisper, right behind me. Let me in. I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I slammed the brakes. The truck skidded on the ice, the trailer groaning as it lurched forward, the force slamming me against the seatbelt. The tires shrieked against the frozen road, the engine roaring as the whole rig fought to come to a stop. Silence. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. I turned my head. The cab was empty. Nothing behind me. No shadow. No figure. Just the dim glow of the dashboard, reflecting against the frost-coated glass. But I knew something had been there, and now it was gone. I didn't stay to find out where it had gone. I threw the truck back into gear, and drove, pushing through the storm, refusing to stop, refusing to even blink. By the time I reached the next truck stop, the storm had passed, the snow had settled, leaving behind an eerie, untouched landscape of white. I parked, stepped out on shaky legs, and made my way inside. The place was nearly empty. Just a few other drivers hunched over cups of coffee. The radio murmured softly in the background. And that's when I heard it. Another driver went missing last night. On Route 42, authorities say they found his truck abandoned, still running, doors wide open, no signs of struggle, just the storm, the snow, and nothing else. A chill ran down my spine. I turned to the window, staring out at the empty road. I could still see it, that pale figure, those black hollow eyes. And I knew, if I had stopped, if I had let it in, that missing trucker would have been me.